Hello, welcome to the next part of this lesson. We talked about in the previous video brake hydraulic theory. In this video, we're going to talk about brake system overview. We're going to talk a little bit about disc and drum, but mainly we'll cover disc and drum on the next lesson, Thursday. So here's a picture of what I was mentioning on that brake hydraulic theory lesson that you probably previously watched. I hope you did. Basically, here your pedal. Your firewall's right here and your brake pedal is inside here. When you push on that brake pedal, it pushes down in the center of this power brake booster, and this one uses vacuum. So right here is this vacuum line going to the engine. So when the engine creates vacuum, it goes to this check valve right here, and it's going to fill this whole section right here with vacuum, kind of suck all this air out of here and be less than atmospheric pressure. On this side over here, it's basically kind of neutral at this point. This is a moot point. When you push on this push rod inside that goes through this booster into the master cylinder, you're going to allow atmospheric air pressure to push in the backside of here, and in this thing in the center is a rubber diaphragm. It's going to push forward against this vacuum, which is pulling, and then you're pushing your push rod through because your brake pedal. All of that force, mechanical advantage, this vacuum advantage, the pressure advantage, pushes down into this master cylinder, that's going to push down into this cylinder wall piston inside here. So pretty cool. Here's a cutaway of that. So as you push this push rod down in here, it pushes this piston that has front and rear. This particular master cylinder is divided in a front and rear, primary and secondary reservoir. This one goes to the front, uses a lot of fluid in the disc brakes. The secondary reservoir here goes to the rear, which is actually the front. If you look at open the hood, it's the first reservoir you see. This is the one closest to the firewall, which goes to the disc brakes. That's not always the case, but that's the majority. But again, this rear secondary reservoir goes to the rear brakes, probably drum, smaller amount of volume in here. And then here's your output kind of dash line right here. Springs and seals, square cuts push it back. Notice this push rod from the booster or brake pedal has to be exact to this piston. So when this piston is relaxed, nothing's, it's at rest. Nothing's pushing on it, and same with this push rod. They want them to touch. Too much pressure and you're going to basically actuate the brake system. If there's not enough pressure and a gap there, when you push on the brakes, it'll go thunk and then it'll work. So the depth of this push rod is adjustable and it has to be just right. And if you remember, we had that dial caliper with a depth gauge that I was using to measure CDs and the depth of washers and bushings and bearings and electrical tape. You would use that depth gauge to see how big this hole is from this flange, and then you would use this flange point to measure on the booster and adjust the push rod accordingly. So kind of neat the way that works. And then of course, what's filled up inside there? Brake fluid. What kind of brake fluid's out there? .3, 4, 5, 5.1. So most common is .3, that's Department of Transportation 3, and 4. 4 is mainly European. Both collect water because they're hygroscopic. That D should be a G. It's hygroscopic, absorbs water. And then basically what happens is it raises boiling point the higher it goes. But just know that .5 you can't mix that. Silicone should not be mixed with 3 or 4. So just keep that in mind. So stick to 3 or 4, stick to OE, and you'll be fine. Don't be mixing different brake fluids. And you want to make sure it doesn't have moisture in there. You want to keep it sealed and clean. It's your life. Braking is the number one thing, right? So all this fluid goes down to either a disc or a drum. We're going to talk about disc right now just because it helps with the theory of brakes. We'll talk more about disc service and operation on the next lesson. But basically fluid comes down here. We have it right here. Brake fluid comes across here, fills this cavity, pushes this piston in on both sides right here. This is a dual caliper or dual piston caliper, probably 4 pistons actually on both sides. It's a fixed caliper, meaning it doesn't slide around. So it's got a crossover tube right here. Basically fluid, the gist is to keep this light and simple, is fluid. Oops, move my mouse. So this rotor right here turns attached to the wheel. This caliper is mounted to the spindle, and then fluid comes in where this green area is, and as you push the pedal and it goes through that mechanical and hydraulic advantage, it's going to push and build pressure against the back of this yellow piston on both sides, and it's going to squeeze these pads against the spinning rotor, slowing it down. Now, if you got a single piston floating caliper, they're a little bit different. So as you fill up, it has one piston on one side, or it can have two pistons on one side, but the other side has no pistons. So what happens is as fluid comes in here from the brake line and it pushes on this piston, it'll push on this pad just like on the fixed caliper. But what happens as it pushes on this pad, the whole housing goes out and it pushes away, and eventually, as you can tell, this is hooked around. It's going to squeeze against this side with this pad. So this one's connected to this, and it kind of, the whole thing floats. And this is what I call a floating caliper. So yeah, here's an assembly of that. Just kind of showing you a floating caliper assembly. Here's your piston. You have this piston seal, goes in that groove right there. This dust boot keeps dirt out so the seal lasts long and doesn't leak. Anti-rattle clips hold the pads from rattling around, hence their name, anti-rattle clip. Sometimes people put goo and pads on the back of them to stop with the rattle noise. Some people don't like that, so yeah, something you could do. And then yeah, piston seal prevents leakage, and then the boot, we talked about that. All right, so talked about that. And then here is kind of how the piston works under pressure. When I push pressure, that square cut seal will kind of bend forward. You see that? When I let go of the pressure, that bend is going to help push this piston off the pad. That's why when you let go of the brakes, it doesn't keep dragging on the rotor. The pads will actually back off just a touch. It doesn't, just a hair. Just this flex of this square cut seal. And that helps with pad wear. So on disc brakes though, instead of going into a caliper, it's going to go into a wheel cylinder. So you push, the fluid goes into here and it fills up this cavity and it pushes these two pistons out, and these rods go out to shoes, and that'll push against a drum and slows it down. But I will show you more about that on the next lesson, because drum brakes are kind of complicated. So disc brake pads, they can be riveted or bonded, meaning they're kind of looks like little rivets. The pad will be riveted to the frame, or they're bonded, meaning glued. And then the linings can be made out of organic, semi-metallic, or ceramic. Typically organic is your cheaper pads. They create a lot of dust. Semi-metallic is the most common. They're really good for towing and whatnot. And then of course ceramic, typically racing applications. It just depends what your preference is. Every car feels different. Drivers prefer different things. I personally like semi-metallic pads. They work great. They do wear the rotor more, and they make some noise because they're semi-metallic, but just depends. Again, the organic is going to be your cheap pads that wear fast and create a lot of dust. So anti-rattle clips we talked about. They keep pads from vibrating and rattling. Brake pad shims I talked about. They put on the back of the pad. And then of course you have pad aware sensors. They can either be a mechanical, basically a pin that when the pad wears thin enough, the pin hits the rotor and it's going to screech and squeal and be loud. Well, if you, let's say, drive a BMW and you're part of a golf club, country club, and go play tennis with your peers, you can't be embarrassed with the squeaking brake pads. So fancy cars use electronic sensors. So they put this sensor right here, so when this pad wears out against the rotor right here, this rusty part's the rotor, this is the caliper housing, and then this is the pad, the backing, and this is the pad material. When this pad material wears so thin, the rotor hits the sensor, it's going to turn on a light. It'll let you know, hey, shh, you need brake pads, without telling your friends or embarrassing you. So that's important, right? So brake pad wear can tell us a lot as a tech. Basically, normal wear should be even. All the pads should wear evenly together. If you have cracked lining, you can have problem here with heat buildup, right? Lining worn completely, rivets exposed, rotors destroyed. This pad's worn beyond safe. This someone just kept on driving and kept on driving, ignored that. Right here, step-in lining, you have kind of a shoulder. Something's not installed correctly or loose or broken. Tapered wear, see how it's thick here, thin here, but if you go over here, the top is thin and the bottom's thick, so the whole thing's kind of tapered. That can be that caliper is worn out, not sliding right on the hardware. It could be sticking and groove on one side. And then you got grooves on this one, probably indicative of rotors not being turned. Someone pad slapped it typically, because rotors will get grooves when they get older. They need to be turned or replaced when you swap pads. which means resurfaced or refinished. So it's a nice smooth flat surface for the next set of pads. And you can only go so far. If you cut them too much, those rotors, they get too thin, then the piston and the caliper can actually come out and leak, and they're dangerous. So there is a minimum turn thickness, just like the drums have a maximum distance because they wear from the inside out instead of outside in. So something to think about with pads. You use those for diagnosing and helping the customer. But basically, they're just friction devices. They're going to pinch up against a rotor, and that rotor can be made up of, it could be cast iron, could be carbon fiber. Here's a picture of a carbon fiber rotor on your Porsche, nice and fancy. They can be, let's see here. You got on his front ones, they're dual layer and vented in the center with hollow vanes. That allows heat dissipation because these create a lot of heat. They can also be cross drilled and grooved, again, to let some of that heat and gases out, because as you're compressing the pad against the rotor, it's going to create gas. That gas can be compressed, and it can affect your braking. So some other things on rotors, some complaints, some symptoms, is getting off a freeway. You ever felt coming off a freeway and hit your brakes and the whole car shudders? Well, that can be basically the rotor being out of parallelism, the thickness variation, excuse me, lateral runout, or hot spots. Excuse me, dry throat. So you have this dial indicator here that's checking his rotor for thickness variations and parallelism. Excuse me, not thickness variation, but parallelism and runout. If you use a micrometer at different points, that would check this rotor for thickness variation. Basically what happens is if it's thin here, thick here, or warped over here and kind of wavy, that you're going to feel that in the pedal in the car, and it's going to get a lot of complaints. Another thing you can see is that they'll get hot spots, these little blue hot spots right here. They get really, really hard, and that can affect the friction and braking of the rotor. So that basically is going to conclude this video, and I will see you on Thursday.